Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Phil Howard, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar with a number of prominent colleagues. Let me start with a little bit of housekeeping. First and foremost, we are fortunate to have a varied audience with us today with a wide range of views. And so we request that the opinions of others are respected during the conversation, during our time together. For your awareness, the event will be recorded and it will be posted on our website following the event itself. There'll be time for a Q&A at the end of the session, so please feel free to pose any questions using the Q&A tab at any time. Keep questions as concise as possible. These will be visible to all attendees, and we'll endeavor to follow up on any unanswered questions. And there's, of course, a system for upvoting questions, and we'll do our best to tackle as many as we can in our time together. First, let me introduce then our panelists and invite you all to turn on your cameras. I'm Phil Howard, Director of the Oxford Internet Institute, and ostensibly the chair for three great minds who will lead us through some of the critiques and creative projects that technology firms have been playing with in response to the COVID crisis. We have with us Carly Kind, who's Director of the Ada Lovelace Institute. Welcome, Carly. We have Ravi Naik, a co-founder of AWO, and welcome, Ravi. And we have Anna Grouverman, a Group Product Manager from Spotify, who's also here to join us for this afternoon's conversation. Now, the webinar itself, our hour together, will be loosely structured because I know we'll have a lot to talk about. I've invited each panelists to think about 2 or 3 comments they might like to make over 4 or 5 minutes each, and we'll start with Carly in a second. Then we'll have a small group conversation. I expect we'll say things that are provocative, evocative, and need responding to, so we'll probably have a short conversation, 10 minutes or so amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up for the big picture questions and the large group Q&A. And remember, once we hit to that point, you can all upvote the questions and we'll try as much as possible to have 1 or 2 of us address the most prominent questions. So welcome, and let's start with Carly. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So I thought I'd just speak a little about what the Ada Lovelace Institute has been working on throughout COVID around tech responses and just raise a couple of observations in that context. But by way of background very quickly, the Ada Lovelace Institute is a research institute and a deliberative body with a remit to ensure that data and AI work for people and society. And we focus on research that's directed at understanding what the societal impacts of new technologies are and to mitigating the negative impacts and improving opportunities for the positive impacts. Around COVID, we've been focusing on the use of technology as part of the health system response. And in particular, we've been looking at digital contact tracing apps, symptom tracking apps, and this emerging area of immunity certification or immunity passports, as it's often called. And I'm sure the audience is probably familiar with some of the ups and downs and the trials and tribulations of the contact tracing app that have been met in the UK. But to summarise that very quickly, the NHS was developing a digital app to support manual contact tracing efforts that enabled people to use their mobile phone as a proxy of themselves and detect when they had been exposed to other individuals also using a mobile phone as a proxy for themselves who later reported symptoms of COVID. That has been a bit of a roller coaster for the NHS, not least because of decisions they made around the technical design, which meant that the data for the app was stored centrally and didn't deploy an API designed by Google and Apple, which essentially would have enabled them to overcome some challenges with the operating system. And they later went back on that decision and decided to go the Google and Apple API route. We're currently in a state of suspended animation when it comes to digital contact tracing in the UK. We understand that there's an app under development which utilizes the Google Apple API, but it's not really clear yet how, when that will be rolled out. And it's frankly not clear how central that is to the track and trace strategy anymore. I think there's been a lot of change in rhetoric around that. That's been a very interesting experience. I think it's a fascinating case study around technology deployment in the context of policy making for a number of reasons. I think it's demonstrated the importance of public trust in technology and how declining levels of public trust or calling into question public trust can actually have very real impacts on the ability to roll out a successful piece of tech. In this case, the trust issue got tied up very closely with this question of where the data is stored centrally or decentrally. And although there's probably an argument that a centralized option was a better option even from a proportionality perspective, because it enabled the government to obtain more data about where COVID might be spreading, in any event, it didn't really matter because this whole furore ballooned out of control around the decisions that were being made about central versus decentral, and that undermined the app's deployment and caused, I think, lots of questions to be called about how useful or not useful the app would be or how important it is. So I think there's a big lesson for government in terms of trust and the ways in which you build trust in new technologies. And I think that leads on to a question about the process that was followed around the app's development, and in particular whether or not some type of independent oversight would have contributed to public trust. There was an ethics board appointed, but it wasn't quite in the public domain. It wasn't quite clear what powers the ethics board had. And I think those types of things contributed to the questions of public trust as well. But I think overcoming all of that, particularly from the Ada Lovelace Institute's perspective, right from the beginning, has been a big question around efficacy. And this is always a difficult one to establish around new technologies, because this is literally being developed in the context of a pandemic at speed for the first time. But it has been very unclear from the start what evidence there is to demonstrate how efficacious digital contact tracing apps are or can be. And there's been insufficient effort to try to demonstrate that, to muster the evidence. There have been some trials, the results of those trials weren't necessarily published. And I think that there's a big lesson to be taken from that about how you need to show that your tech works in order for people to really buy into it. And for me, that's a heartening suggestion that actually most people are digitally savvy enough now that they don't necessarily buy into the hype around technology. They understand that tech has benefits and disadvantages, that has trade-offs, and that it needs to be rolled out as part of a system that is also trustworthy. And I think we've moved beyond the age of there's an app for that, this notion that apps can fix problems. I think most people are quite realistic about that now, and that's certainly been born to bear in the last few months. I'm probably reaching the end of my 5 minutes. As you can see, I have a lot to say about this, so I'll save some of those things for later on, including about immunity certification regimes, which is something that the Ada Lovelace Institute continues to work on, and where I think much of the conversation around COVID technology is about to go. That is around digital identity systems and apps that can establish identity. And so hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that in this conversation.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Carly. I expect public trust is one of the touch points that we'll all hit on today. Ravi, what are you thinking about? What are you working on these days?
Thanks, Phil. Thank you for having me here today. It's great to be part of this really excellent panel. So I had a slightly odd position in this matter. I'm not a technologist. I'm not medically trained. I'm a solicitor and the legal director at AWO, which is a new data rights agency, as well as being a visiting fellow at the excellent Oxford Internet Institute. So how did I come to be here to explore and consider the tech responses to our pandemic? Well, that journey really speaks to the wider concerns that we have about the current system that's been deployed in England, and the news that's breaking today that following our work, the government has accepted that test and trace, the current system was deployed unlawfully. And it's quite good timing around this panel that I can speak to that today. So initially, obviously, everyone supported all of the responses that were being undertaken to ensure that we could get back to normality. I mean, who couldn't in those early days when it looked like the world was folding in on ourselves? But it quickly became quite apparent that technology would be the English government's answer to the pandemic. Tech solutionism, I guess, writ on a national scale. However, it's not quite clear how that technology would work and whether such technology could actually be deployed with appropriate respect for privacy and the protection of personal data. And I distinguish between privacy and data protection quite deliberately. as the laws to protect personal data are not about privacy alone or the private sphere, that famous right to be let alone. Rather, the protections on data and information are about enabling society to govern our relationships with technology. And this has been really borne out through the tech response to the pandemic. Our first instruction as lawyers was to conduct a human rights analysis of the proposed responses as they were being proposed in April. And that mostly took the form, as Carla's explained really well, of an app. And our view at that time was that the English government's preferred option of centralizing all the data and departing from the standards as set by Google and Apple required greater justification, as it resulted in a greater interference with individual rights. We also made clear that any system designed to address the pandemic that involved large-scale processing of personal data would require a risk assessment that analysed the impact on individual data, rights and freedoms. That was a legal requirement under the GDPR. And in subsequent months, following considerable scrutiny, the app lost a lot of traction, becoming, and to quote the government, the cherry on the cake rather than the cake itself. So what was the cake? It was the test and trace system. And that move towards the test and trace system instead of the app signalled a change of approach by the government, but did not change the applicable law. Test and trace still had to comply with all the privacy and data protection regulations that existed, as we set out in our legal opinion. On the 25th of May, the government started to make moves towards launching the test and trace system that week. And on the 26th of May, I tweeted, just kind of innocently, to ask if anyone has seen a DPIA for test and trace. It was coming out that week, surely there must be one. I knew that one had been conducted for the app, so I assumed there must have been one in place for the test and trace system. And then Politico asked the Department for Health and Social Security about this data protection impact assessment, and were told that one was being conducted, but had not been by that point. But it was all a bit vague. We weren't quite sure what was happening. So we were then instructed by Open Rights Group to ask questions about the deployment of the system and whether a DPIA had been conducted. Firstly, we noted that test and trace data would be stored for 20 years. We asked the government to justify this length in light of the need to store data for no longer than is necessary. In response, the government offered no justification, but rather just agreed to change the retention period from 20 years to 8. We still have no idea why it was ever 20 years, or what's happened to people whose data was stored in that period. In fact, the privacy notice on the government's website still says 20 years as of today, so who knows when that change is going to happen. But secondly, probably and more importantly, is the data protection impact assessment. The law requires an impact assessment for obvious reasons to be conducted before the system is deployed, before the processing takes place. So we asked, quite simply, have you done one? We were met with very deliberately obtuse responses, with the government really refusing to engage with that simple question of whether DPI had been conducted. And eventually we were forced to write a pre-action letter threatening litigation. In response, the government conceded that no DPIA was conducted. They further confirmed that one was required, and in turn, we're left with a world-beating, unlawful test and trace system. And there are a myriad of reasons why this matters. I'm sure we'll get into this in the discussion, whether data protection should get in the way of innovation and our response to the pandemic. However, the one that sticks for me, and it's been explored already, is trust. Trust and confidence in the way test and trace uses personal data is essential to achieving high levels of public participation that we expect are needed to make the program a success. It seems critical to me to not lose that trust. I'm really looking forward to discussing that all today.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Ravi. Yes, I think trust is going to be the constant theme. I could say a little bit about what our team has been working on, and then pass to Anna for some of her thoughts on the tech response to COVID. I'll start off maybe by highlighting some of our research findings, which suggest that the tech response in other domains has been okay, if not positive, and worth acknowledging. One of my colleagues, Nahima Marshalf, just finished a study about 2 months ago about what happens when the average person searches for COVID information on YouTube. And she found that most of the time, most people will get professional news content. They won't get junk health news. In fact, it was on average one of the top 20 hits that an average person searching for the basic COVID words would get a piece of misinformation. So this is in a sense an end user audit kind of study, but it shows that for the most part, most people won't encounter that stuff unless they go searching for it, right? So if you purposefully want to use social media to find extremist, conspiratorialist, sensationalist content, you can find it, but in this particular study, in this case, the YouTube search results, the bias simply wasn't there. Now, one of the interesting things about that finding is that the top search results when people go to YouTube for health news are not from public health providers. They're not from the CDC or WHO. They are from professional news organizations. So I think this points to the central role that independent news organizations still play in public life and still play in generating content for social media platforms, right? That's the content people go looking for. We've also been doing a weekly memo summarizing the trends in misinformation on social media. So we've got a list of 120, 130 odd websites dedicated to producing health misinformation, COVID misinformation. We track their output and see how it travels across social media. Over the course of the last few months, we found in the first few months that China and Russia, the Chinese and Russian governments were generating significant amounts of health misinformation that would occasionally outperform the stuff produced by professional news outlets. And this content had 2 or 3 core themes. The first message was that in this public health crisis, your democracies won't serve you. They're too slow moving. We don't have smart leaders. Elected officials never act quickly enough. Democratic institutions can't be decisive when it comes to managing a health crisis. The second message was that China and Russia are leading the science. So the Russians would say that the Russian scientists are leading. Chinese government would say the Chinese scientists are leading in the search for a cure. This was just promotional content. The third thing was that both the Russian governments and the Chinese governments promoted messages about the aid that they're offering to Western democracies. So sending masks to the White House, sending hospital equipment to northern Italy. These exercises sort of all fit the message. Your democracies won't protect you. We're leading the science, and look, we're leading in sufficient ways to be able to provide aid. These are the consistent findings week to week. And about 2 weeks ago, we did a study to see whether these themes were also picked up in French and Spanish and German, and we found that they were. So we've now got multilingual content analysis. And of course, one of the interesting points of doing this kind of work is that these are social media accounts in English, French, German, and Spanish on social media platforms that are illegal in China, right? So this is content on platforms that their own citizens can't always use in an unfettered way. I think I would actually want to end, though, a little bit upbeat. There's an occasional week where the junk news from the Russia Today or CGTN can outperform something from the BBC or CNN, depending on the news story. But for the most part, I think Twitter has been sharing data more regularly and more consistently than they ever have before. As I mentioned earlier, YouTube search at least seems to be working in the week that we did the study. Facebook flagging systems seem to be working when it comes to identifying misinformation. And of course, a number of platforms have been more aggressive at labeling what's probably one of the most important sources of misinformation, the US president, as misinformation when it comes to health content. Now, the question in my mind is whether this will last. So I do think that the firms have responded aggressively in the area of public health around the COVID crisis, and in ways they never did for political issues in the previous 4 years. I don't know whether that will last for a long time, whether it'll transpose into the US 2020 election or other elections that are going on around the world. And of course, we don't know whether they're doing the same due diligence in Arabic and Hindi and Punjabi and Polish, the range of other languages that just don't have independent researchers or journalists chasing these things. So we don't actually know whether they're being as careful as they appear to be in some instances in the languages we speak. So that's how I'd sum up what we're thinking on, what we're thinking about, and what we've found in our study of the tech response to COVID. Anna, what are you working on? What are you thinking about in terms of the tech response to COVID?
Yes, thank you. It's good to be here. So as Phil mentioned, I am currently leading several product teams at Spotify, and we always work on some of the most used features in Spotify, like playlists in your library. Obviously, different context, different lens on this today. And also I should mention, prior to Spotify, I spent about 7 years at Google working on Google's productivity apps. So Google Docs, Gmail, etc. And obviously, this is a really interesting time for digital tools and kind of being on the front lines of product development in this space. In many ways, we're seeing a renewed focus publicly on a lot of these products. So there's been obviously a lot of really positive publicity and increased usage of Zoom, for instance, which we're all on today. And there's an increased role that these products are playing in keeping people connected and entertained during this time. So at Spotify, we've seen an uptick in peer-to-peer, kind of user-to-user interaction, a huge spike, for example, in collaborative playlists in the last few months. Also a shift in how people are using the product. Fewer people are driving, but more people are streaming in different ways inside their home. So streaming through televisions, streaming through their mobile phones as usual, but more use of smart speakers and stuff like that. All of that is really interesting and highlights that these products are filling an important niche, really, and keeping people both connected and hopefully happy and entertained at a time when it's very easy for everyone under quarantine and in lockdown to feel more disconnected. So we hope there's a lot of positive implications for mental health. There's, for instance, also been an uptick in the streaming of podcast content related to health and meditation. And we're seeing, and this is all public information, we're seeing a lot of streaming for music that we would characterize as chill. So it looks like people are also turning to what would maybe in other cases be more entertainment and upbeat entertainment content to kind of find some soothing and calming vibes for this time. And finally, you know, if I look at my previous product, there is obviously a huge role that digital tools are playing in maintaining or maybe even increasing productivity. So if we didn't have Zoom, if we didn't have Google Docs, it would be much harder for a lot of us to be working remotely right now. So it's a really interesting time. My team particularly, we recently launched a feature called Group Sessions, which is one of Spotify's first conscious forays into kind of a social space where individuals can collaborate on a live queue of audio tracks together and kind of listen together while being in the same home and eventually hopefully listening together while being apart and geographically distributed. All of that is really exciting. Now, what do I personally think about it? I think we're seeing basically an acceleration of pre-existing trends. We already had digitization of everything that was happening, and now it's simply being accelerated, and there's more public focus on what this might mean for society if we continue down this road, or if we stay at current levels of digitization after hopefully this global health crisis is resolved. So it's exciting to be in this heyday, but at the same time, that means that the companies that are producing these digital tools have to be shifting how they think about the implications of what they're building. For a lot of people, it is no longer a choice. And in some cases, it's an only resort, both for kind of personal wellness, entertainment, mental well-being, as well as for work and productivity. At the same time, just like any other industry, the tech industry is made up of organizations. A lot of them are very large, and they consist of groups of people. which are notoriously slow to change. There are not a lot of processes in place. There's not a lot of thinking and particularly incentives in place to take the broader social context and social implications into account when products are being built. I believe we're seeing this in how a lot of platforms that are being held responsible for distributing misinformation or low quality information are responding to government and public pressure. Their responses are very similar to how they were prior to COVID-19. It's some kind of PR lip service and also a lot of prevaricating around the fact that, do we really want Facebook to play a role in censoring content, and what is free speech, and kind of very notoriously libertarian, I would say, perspectives. And another thing that I want to mention that's a point of concern for me is, because this is the heyday in an accelerated way of digital tools, there's going to be, and there already is, an impact on the tech workforce. So while a lot of us, a lot of everybody really in the world is under increased stress, and in some cases medical, in other case mental well-being, kind of being separate from loved ones, seeing an uptick of the epidemic and its toll in the news every single day, these companies are under increased pressure and business incentive to put tools out faster and improve them faster, and to build more exciting things. At the same time, not all of them are very mature companies. Not all of them have good human resource practices in place. And what I believe this will lead to is, because stocks are doing really well in the tech industry, hiring is not going into freezing. There's probably going to be some redistribution and employees voting with their feet in terms of switching from companies that did not treat them well and maybe put them under additional stress during this time, and going to companies that at least outwardly seem to be doing better things for their employees. Now, why do I mention this? Well, I think it could have real world implications as well, just beyond the tech force. Because we may see a strengthening, additionally, of companies that are already very wealthy, already very big, and already able to attract top talent, whereas smaller companies that are less able to do human resources in the right way, or less willing perhaps, they will lose a lot of talent. And so we will see those products in companies that lose talent will produce lower quality products. So that'll have implications for society as a whole. And one of the last things that I want to mention, because I believe I'm almost at 5 minutes, is what I would really love to see is better incentives being built in to product development within the industry for thinking about real world social consequences for the things that we are putting out. Currently, that is not part of the product development process at all in most cases, and there's simply not enough cross-pollination between social science thinking and even just liberal arts and sort of critical thinking that is not quantitatively driven, and the tech industry. And I think we're going to see these implications play out in more severe ways in the near future.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, this is another cross-cutting theme, right? Product development and the challenge of technology development. And if one of your editorial opinions would be that sometimes tech rolls out things too quickly, especially under COVID crisis, and Carly and I are interested in the way big technology firms develop new platforms and roll them out quickly, and Ravi's noticed that they get rolled out quickly, and sometimes government doesn't even check how they're getting rolled out quickly. It could be that one of the current problems or grand challenges is how to allow tech to move quickly in a way that's responsible and responsive to human rights, the human rights claims we all have. So one of the things that's interesting about this group is that we have several of us interested in the role that tech has played in the information we're getting about the crisis. Several of us interested in the role of tech in our cultural adaptation and our coping and our organizational behavior. And several of us interested in watching how tech may be part of the cure, or the search for a cure, or at least for improving public understanding in such a way as we get healthier. Let me ask a cross-cutting question for all of you. If you if you got a do-over, or if you could remake the tech response to COVID, if you could restart things, what would you want the first primary, most important response from big tech firms to be in this crisis?
I can start this one. I think overall, I would like the tech industry to have a bigger focus before the crisis hit on human questions and human interests. That is ostensibly the case for a lot of companies and for much of the industry, at least when we see TED Talks and sort of industry conventions. That is very much the flashpoint of the day. We're trying to remake society, we're trying to improve society, we're innovating for society, etc. That does not often percolate in a big way to the way products are developed and even the way product vision is set. In the end, these companies do operate as businesses, whereas their implications, I would argue, go far beyond what previous types of businesses could do. You know, if you were, I'm going to make a mediocre example now, but if you were constructing like heavy machinery at the beginning of the 20th century, probably you did not affect as many people with that as by building a social media platform. Mm-hmm. So I would have remade those incentives, you know, before the crisis even started. And I would sort of have the industry look both at implications for users in a more long-term way, and also implications for employees and the teams actually responsible for building these things.
Wonderful, thank you. Carly, did you have a...
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I suppose my instinct is to not accept the premise of the question, which is that big tech itself should make decisions about how technology should serve in the pandemic response. I think that in almost all cases, the use of tech should follow the asking of what is the problem we're trying to solve. And I think those best qualified to ask that in the context of a pandemic are public health and health professionals rather than tech companies. I think if we let innovation be led by big tech in the context of this particular situation, that's not going to be informed by the best assessment of public health needs, and thus won't necessarily bear the fruits we want it to lead. I think going back though, things that could be done differently, you know, I wish we had a better sense of just how skewed suffering from this pandemic would be towards vulnerable populations, because I think then we could have tried to develop tech or innovation that specifically address those people, because it simply isn't the case that if we revisit the beginning of the pandemic and the types of analysis that led to an investment in contact tracing over other types of tech interventions, the premise of that was that this is a problem that affects all of us equally, and we need to try to control it in that way. And one of the problems is asymptomatic transmission of this, and we need to be able to trace contacts, and therefore why don't we try to use tech to do that? But actually what we found was there are a group of people that are far, far, far more vulnerable to this illness than others. How can we best identify those people? How can we best support them? How can we deliver them services so that they can self-isolate? That could have been a problem challenge that the tech industry equally could have invested in addressing. And then the other thing I would say is from a policy perspective, I think there could be much more investment in data than in tech, because I think one thing we've seen from the statistics reporting, which, you know, the problems of which still plague Public Health England, is that there's just not a good enough handle on data around public health and around treatment, etc. And we still don't have the clearest picture. There have been some real data sharing challenges between central government and local government, for example. And some of that certainly could have been the focus, and that's much more banal tech questions about, you know, data infrastructure. How do you enable data to be shared better in times of emergencies, that we really could have invested in over the kind of sexy new piece of tech.
Right. And so we don't really talk about public technology much anymore. I think there was a time when our instinct with an exciting new invention would have been to build it into public infrastructure, but, you know, it sounds like one way of a do-over might have involved allowing or encouraging the social media firms to work directly with public health officials to distribute their message, rather than the message of politicians who had who did some framing work, right, around COVID. And even now, I have a hard time imagining that we could expect Facebook or Twitter to brush aside public figures who are politicizing health and really just rely on the health professionals or better sources of data.
I think probably realistically, the division isn't as clear between the politicians and even public health, which is not to impugn them, but to say that I think there are politics at many levels in a crisis such as these. And I also think it's a really difficult set of questions, because I also don't think that technology innovation should be government-led either. It shouldn't be that government should come to a tech company and say, this is the spec of what we need, because that's not going to enable the best ideas either to come forth. So I think there's a big challenge about what is the relationship between defining the problem and defining the solution, and where do each sit, and how do you do it at speed in the context of a crisis as well.
Okay, I'll turn to Ravi for the question of how do we define each and get to speed. But I want to remind everybody that you're welcome to drop questions in the Q&A. I can see a few collecting. Ravi will offer some answers, offer some thoughts, and then we'll open it up. Ravi, what do you think? Is data the...
Right. Well, I mean, just to go back to your initial question first, cause I think it's a really good one about what should we do differently? Particularly, I mean, looking at this from a lawyer's perspective on behalf of what we've seen for our clients. First, I'd really support what Carly was saying about the power dynamic between big tech and governments, and actually what does that speak to, that our own government couldn't employ a contact tracing system they wanted to because of the power of big tech. That really speaks to an ingrained culture that way predates the pandemic, and it's something that we need to think more carefully about. And when I actually look at the responses that we had, the thing for me that really strikes out, and particularly today's story about track and trace being deployed unlawfully, is the failure to employ data protection by design and default, to really bake in and stitch in data protection and privacy into the way these tools are being designed. So it was clear from the outset that these systems were going to have an impact on privacy. And I think most people would accept those kind of impacts. But the fact that there was no real consideration given at all to those risks speaks to not just the failing to have data protection by design, but just not thinking about it in any way. And that's a real problem for, as Carly says, and the second question, about actually should we be focusing on data or technology, or where should the focus be? Because if you really analyze what you're doing, assess and audit the need for the technology, you might start to actually understand, well, what do we need? What's going to assist us get through this pandemic and help us get out of the situation we are, to get our life back towards normalcy. But one of the things I've seen during the time of the pandemic is that big tech companies have employed systems that could be used moving forwards. For example, when you Google search the words coronavirus or COVID-19, you're presented with a bespoke page saying, here's all the government responses, likewise on Twitter. There's no reason that couldn't be employed, for example, in elections. Phil, myself, Oxford Internet Institute have worked together on responses that are data and democracy. There's no reason those systems couldn't be taken forward. But if there's an election, it's quite clear where official sources of news are from. I think that's a really interesting thing, that now there's a false narrative there that maybe wasn't there before.
Right. Thank you. What else? Anything you want to ask each other we should talk about as a group?
Can I just come in on just that last point that Ravi made? So one of the things that might be interesting for the participants and audience to know is around that display of information in response to Google searches. That is as a result of the NHS syndicating their content out and striking agreements with tech companies around this, particularly Google. But you might remember from last year, there was this big hoo-ha about Amazon Alexa reading out NHS content, and the fact that the contract itself was worded in a way that was kind of beneficial to Amazon over the NHS. But essentially it was about syndicating NHS content out through Amazon, in particular, thinking of Alexa. And they've done subsequently the same with Google search results. And that, I think the NHS syndication of content is a really interesting example to think about, because it's not a tech solution, but it's a great example of of tech companies and the public health service collaborating to have very meaningful results. It's very meaningful that if you put symptoms into Google, the first result that comes up is an NHS excerpt and not something else. I think previously it was maybe WebMD was the more preferenced result, and now it's NHS. And I think that's just a great example of when that type of collaboration can deliver real results. A second point is to say that when there was that kind of furore around the Amazon deal, it was a result of there being a power differential between the NHS and Amazon when they went in to negotiate about the terms of the syndication. And I think that's going to be an ongoing challenge for governments and tech companies when they're collaborating together, that there feels very much to policymakers, to governments, that they are at a power disadvantage going into those negotiations. And we might talk about the Palantir deal as well around the NHS data store, which Palantir, the first contract was for £1, the subsequent contract was for £1 million. I think there's a very interesting question there around power and procurement and technology, and in particular the fact that there are very few companies that offer the services that these governments or these public health agencies actually want. So do they really have bargaining power when they're at the negotiating table? And then the third point that I just wanted to make around that syndication question is the question of reputation and trust. So actually you can think about the NHS having quite a lot of power, because the NHS brand is an incredibly well-respected and well-trusted brand. And in a world of misinformation, actually, for Google to be able to put up front a very trusted search result, it is of a benefit to them as well, and advertising can be delivered alongside those search results and translate into economic incentives as well. But it's also an example of why the onus on the NHS when it engages in any tech development is very high, because it has so much to lose around trust, because it's really dealing in this very, very trusted brand, and the internet is not a trusted place, and so bringing those two things together is really problematic. I know that's a slight kind of offshoot to this conversation, but I think it was a good example that Ravi brought up.
Thank you, Carly. So we sort of on this theme, we've got a couple of questions, anonymous questions about innovation and creating new things, and maybe going forward. One of our attendees points out that there were multiple interesting startups out of the 2018 economic crisis, and so the question is, what might be innovative and new that comes out of this hardship, or what can we learn from those previous crises that might be meaningful for tech innovation? And so I would add an additional spin. Let's imagine that there is a second wave, or that there's a rise of COVID-like symptoms in the fall, through the winter, 6 months from now. What forms of innovation might we want to see over the next 6 months that would create, that would provide some kind of tech response we would want? Well, multiple big questions there, but what do all of you think? The role of innovation in tech in helping us manage the crisis 6 months from now?
I mean, one very quick challenge, I don't have the answer for it, is how can tech help to address the inevitable rising unemployment, and but it help to address it for those who are in sectors that are less able to be digitized, as it were. I mean, all of us, we have very few fears for our jobs in a real sense, because we can do them remotely, and that can continue on for as long as we need, but that is not the case for many other people. And so, you know, tech has made people's lives better in the context of the crisis if you can work from home, absolutely, and products like Spotify, but Zoom and others have absolutely improved that. But what about for those people who can't easily take their jobs into offline, remote sense? And are there a way, you know, is it through actually much more infrastructure heavy investments around, you know, digital exclusion, kind of closing the gap around digital exclusion, getting devices to people, getting people's digital literacy up? Or is there a way for tech to help to do digital transformation for industries that aren't yet digitally transformed?
Mm-hmm. So I can spin this question in another way, maybe for Anna and Ravi. Ravi, if a big tech firm wanted to start a new contact tracing app, could they actually get it through government and satisfy the things that you would want to see in terms of protecting privacy in 6 months or less? And then Anna, if somebody could, if one of the major technology firms wanted to roll this application out, could they do it in a meaningful way in 6 months just with the development resources? Or are there only certain firms that could ever actually pull that off in 6 months? Either of you.
I'm happy to start. Thanks, Phil. It's a great set of questions. So in terms of whether a contact tracing app could now be made and help us get through this, I think the evidence suggests that the apps that do exist don't really provide that level of information to allow people to get through this. The uptake's been very slow. It's very unclear what they're designed for. I mean, one end of the spectrum, you have, I guess we could call self-regulatory apps to allow you to know if you've been in contact with someone. On the other end of that spectrum, you have these surveillance tools. I mean, that's effectively what they are. They allow the government to surveil how the pandemic's spreading. And I would say whoever designs this, it has to work with Google and Apple's products to allow there to be enough uptake. And secondly, there has to be enough public trust and confidence in the system. And thirdly, probably most importantly from my view, is that rights have to be built into that innovation. Rights have to be part of innovation, not something that stands in the way of innovation. And I think that's a message that all tech companies could take moving forward, and not just for the response to COVID-19. The one thing I am worried about, just to finish that thought, is the idea that contact tracing or the technology around it becomes a proxy for immunity passports. The World Health Organization have said there's, immunity is not really a thing. We can't really define it because nobody really knows if you can be reinfected and all the rest. So to allow people to be certified to live their life in a different way to others, I think is a very dangerous door, and I'm yet to see a justification that will allow that to be lawful. So it'll be very interesting to see what the rest of the panel think about that.
Yeah, going back to the way I believe the question was also phrased initially, some of the startups that came out of the last recession, if we look at them today, so they're, Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, they're essentially markers of the gig economy. And with the benefit of hindsight and with the benefit of a few years having passed since their inception, we now see that a lot of them are actually mining areas of vulnerability among their users for financial gain. And a lot of them are startups, so they're new. They came out of venture capital investments made as a result of business opportunities becoming apparent during and after the recession. So the first part of my response is startups and new companies are motivated by venture capital interests, and they're funded by venture capital interests. And so they're not going to be altruistic. They might happen to align with what society needs and what government incentives put in place, but that's not a guarantee, which means that there's a huge onus on actually the big tech firms to be the ones that would roll something like this out, because they have the benefit of capital, and they have, a lot of them have balance sheets that allow for investments that don't promise to ever turn a profit, but that do have huge PR benefits. So the ability for someone like a Google or Facebook to say, we did this for altruistic reasons because we want society to be better. So, the answer to your question, Phil, in 6 months, could someone pull this off? Big tech firms might. I would say 6 months in terms of development is not a long time at all. But they have the resources. They could throw a lot of resources behind this and try to do it. Now, sort of my social scientist take on this is, do we want them to? Because as someone aptly said when I believe Google launched Google Photos, if a product is free, that's because you are the product. So do we want companies that already have immense amounts of data about individuals to be collecting more data? And this is one of the things, by the way, that I noticed in some of our earlier discussion. There is a temptation to think about tech and data as two separate and somewhat binary things, but they're actually one and the same. Technology today exists to collect data. So if there is a contact tracing app, it has a function, but it's also collecting data points. And there is always an altruistic reason for that that gets talked about in TED Talks and conferences, that data is then used to, machine learning or artificial intelligence, and we understand health trends better, et cetera, et cetera. But as we saw from something like 23andMe, where, for years people were sending in their biometric data and finding out to their own delight, like, oh, I seem to be, a lot of me is from Scotland. And then, later 23andMe made a contract with a large insurance provider in the United States. And everyone was very surprised. These companies do have small text that most users will not use. So I actually really worry about government incentives. Because then all that means to me is that data is more shared and more centralized. And to Ravi's point, it can very easily tip into immunity passports and sort of opportunities for discrimination. So amplifying trends in society that already exist and kind of making them more pervasive as a result of technology.
Okay, but then I think we have a point of consensus that we don't want government doing this and we don't want business doing this. Now, it's possible we want civil society, maybe this is something that civil society should be providing, technology solutions, but there's a capacity, and the same, same data protection guarantees questions would have an impact on civil society actors. I'm going to combine several questions in the Q&A about the kinds of policy responses that actually have already appeared just in the last few months to help manage what development goes on around through technology to help address COVID-related problems. And one of the questions suggests that we've tightened down on cybersecurity and that this may constrain innovation in COVID tech solutions. So let's assume that tech solutionism is not something we want to celebrate or rely on, but if there are some apps that would help with contact tracing, might be good to see them in a year. Do we want to relax cybersecurity norms, or Ravi, do we want to cut the government a little bit of slack to help get some solutions done out quickly? And Anna, who's going to do this innovative work if it's not the NHS and not going to be big entrepreneurs?
I'm happy to start, because I think my question was the most direct and maybe the simplest to answer, which is I don't think rights, it's not a question between rights or innovation. I think rights can be part of innovation, must be part of innovation. One of the key principles of data protection is data protection by design and default. That should be a core principle for any technology moving forward. But I think there's a wider legal principle, which we draw on a lot in our legal opinion, which is the idea of necessity and proportionality. You have to really understand, are the data processing techniques being undertaken and the technology that's being deployed absolutely necessary and the least intrusive means to achieve those ends? I think those two simple thoughts, two simple concepts being really part of, baked in, stitched into the way technological responses are put forward, will actually have a meaningful effect on the way we move this forward, both for trust and also to ensure that rights are protected moving forwards.
Okay, yes, but one of our guests makes the point that the policy responses to COVID-19 have been fast and impact other communities and other business sectors that aren't actually working in COVID. So there's spin-off effects to policy response that's too fast, right?
I can add to that.
Sure.
So one of the interesting things that you mentioned, Phil, is essentially, not government and not big tech. And I think that's a good synthesis of what a lot of us were hinting at and saying. One of the things I think about quite a lot is, like I said, we are seeing an amplification of pre-existing trends right now. We want to digitize everything, and we believe tech can be the answer to a lot of these things. But the fascinating thing is a lot of us spend most of our day in front of digital tools, but this is a very biological problem. So as a technologist, I want to hear from doctors and epidemiologists and scientists for them to lead the response and to say what the issues are in this biological problem that maybe have tech opportunities within them or digital opportunities. Otherwise, I would actually prefer to see the tech industry focus on alleviating sort of the symptoms and side effects of this pandemic. So, focusing on assisting with mental health during this time and maintaining productivity without turning productivity draconian, and creating, opportunities for 24/7 surveillance by employers of their employees, for example. So that's one aspect of my thought in response to your question, Phil. And another thing is, to go back to my initial point about the way that product development happens in the tech industry. I think of responses to crises like this as similar to general sort of attempts to foster innovation. So a lot of times companies will look at what they've been doing for the last few years and they'll say, it looks like we are not innovating. And what does that mean? Well, if we're broken up into groups and we're some sort of organization of people, that means within those groups, innovation isn't happening naturally. So the temptation then is to say, okay, we're going to have a separate team. We're going to have a separate department. It'll be off to the side or it'll be up at the top that will focus on innovation exclusively. And it's somehow automatically going to percolate its innovation perspectives and efforts throughout the rest of the organization. In my opinion, that tends to make for an orphan department that actually muddies the water for everybody else, is often really difficult to be a part of, and everyone in the organization tends to hate it, tends to be very unproductive. I worry about similar task forces coming together within tech companies right now, and it's, to me, a symptom of short-term thinking. So we have this global pandemic, let's put together a COVID task force. What are we going to do as a result? What I would prefer to see, again, going back to my initial point, is that there be some inherent focus on social issues always built into each group that makes up the overall organization. That's probably the only way that we're going to have long-term effectiveness in the types of products that come out of big tech and medium and small size tech as well, is to just be thinking about that all the time throughout the org rather than off to the side.
Off to the side. Wonderful. Well, we've got just another minute or so together, and I thought I'd pitch sort of the hardest, toughest question for an easy 15, 30-second answer. I think we're sort of all inclined to say that the data is what we need to be aware of. We need to that the flow of data has more of an impact than perhaps what any particular technology firm does or what any particular app affords. If you could redirect the flow of data in an ethical way with decent public oversight that provided security for personal records, how would you direct the flow of data in a way to help us respond to COVID? My pet answer involves public libraries. I think that libraries, the best information on public problems used to sit in the British Library or the Bodleian or the Library of Congress in the States. That's where the best information on public libraries was, but it's no longer there. It's actually in private held firms, and I'm sure Carly would agree that there are multiple government offices now waking up to the power of the possibilities of AI and data flows. So if you could redirect the flow of data in an abstract way, where would you send it? And I'll start with Carly and then Ravi and then Anna.
Really good question. I think I would say local authorities with a caveat, which is I don't necessarily think they yet possess the capacity to deal with data in the most trustworthy way. And I would like to see that capacity improve. But in particular, in terms of education, I think local authorities are closest to the communities that they serve, and having them, enabling them access to data that they need to make sure that children are either in school or receiving the support that they can get in and around this crisis is incredibly important. And just to say a very quick anecdote I heard from somebody about, during the crisis, the local authorities needed to identify vulnerable children in the authority. And they don't just have data sets on vulnerable children, of course. The best way that they thought that they could find out who those vulnerable children were was by going through free school meal enrollment. So working out who in the borough is enrolled in free school meals. But actually, because some children go to school in boroughs where they don't live, local authorities don't know all of the children within their own borough who have access to free school meals. So they had to all strike data sharing agreements with every other local authority so that they could get access to maybe 1 or 2 children's data about kids who live in their borough but go to school in another borough and get free school meals. All of which sounds like an incredibly involved process taking place against just so many other stresses of the pandemic, which is not to say we shouldn't have data sharing agreements, but that we should have better access for local authorities to this data in the first place.
Fabulous. Local authorities. Thank you. Ravi, what do you think? Where would you direct the flow?
Very good question. And I think I'm going to give maybe a lawyerly answer by saying I don't think it's straightforward. I think it depends. Because I think it really depends on what that data is being used for. And I think part of the problem with how we found ourselves in our current problem is data is just kind of this monolithic thing that people just say, oh, it has to be shared and we need more openness. I agree, but it depends on what the data is being used for. It's questions of necessity and proportionality. But what I would say is whichever way this data is going and whoever it's going to, and for what purpose, those purposes have to be clear. There has to be transparency, accountability, oversight, and enforcement when those things go wrong. And that, to me, seems to be the key issue that's missing at the moment.
Fabulous. So it doesn't matter where, as long as it's transparent and accountable and fair. Right. Thank you. Anna, where would you direct the flow of data if you could?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would second, first of all, everything that's been said already. I would like to see more of it being made available to research institutions. Again, those directly able to deal with and understand this crisis better. So research labs. And to some extent, this availability already exists. But again, I think this is where perhaps government can facilitate the connection between tech and those that need the data tech collects the most, is to actually provide insight to policy and legal teams in tech companies that probably are having to reinvent the wheel in a lot of ways and kind of individually take initiative and try to understand who could use resources that we have but don't know what to do with right now. You know, of course, to touch on an earlier point of the question, we should not, in doing so, be easing requirements for anonymization of data and how secure the data is and privacy issues. And this is an area where tech and engineers within tech particularly can play a really important role of helping to inform what does it mean to truly anonymize data and scrub personally identifiable information out in a way that data cannot be triangulated in any way and cannot be used for any nefarious purposes down the line, but could still be useful for understanding the spread of the pandemic and perhaps opportunities for cure.
Fabulous, thank you. So sending data to local authorities who can use it, sending it to places that can take care of the data, can treat it responsibly, sending it to the researchers who can interpret the data. All three excellent answers. Thank you, all three of you, so much for your time today, for this good conversation. Thank all of you for attending, for listening in. You'll all be getting an email by way of follow-up in due course that'll provide a link to the site and the recording. Our next webinar is on Wednesday, the 22nd of July at 1 o'clock, 1300 UK time, where our Fair Work team will be discussing strategies for improving platform work. They'll be taking up the employment question that Carly hinted to. You can sign up for this talk on our website, our OII website, in the events section. thank you again for everyone for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.